Andreas Krieg. Welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. Now, today we're going to talk about extraordinary events of this past week between Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and the UAE, which started with the ultimatum, or at least the bombing of a Emirati shipment in one of the ports in Yemen, the port of Makalla. And the Emiratis have retreated from Yemen, the south part of Yemen. So we want to hopefully build on what we've talked about already about the way in which the Emiratis function in the region. I think you call it the axis of secessionists, the idea that the Emiratis have built this sort of network of non-state actors that really work as a proxy on its behalf and pursue its strategic ends within the region. So there's a lot to talk about. Now, maybe I should start with Yemen itself. Often when we talk about Yemen, we depict it as a war-torn country, not particularly important, impoverished. A lot of its citizens are now, migrants around the world. And so we tend to dismiss Yemen and not follow it very closely. Is that a fair way to, from your perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, is that a fair way to characterize the importance of Yemen?
No, I think you're not doing justice to the importance of Yemen in its role within the region, as well as in the role within the history of the Gulf and the history of Arabia. So most of the tribes that you see living on the eastern part of Arabia, what we call the Gulf today, have their root in that part of Arabia, in Yemen.
Yeah.
You go to the Quran, there's a lot of, there's the talk about King Abraha, for example. So Yemen features in there as well. You go back to Roman history, the Romans called it Felix Arabia, as the happy Arabia. That's the part where people were happy because they lived in abundance. They had water, natural resources, unlike the more deserted, arid parts of Arabia further north and east. Yeah. And then you're moving into the 21st century. And obviously even Yemen today, yes, it is impoverished. And yes, it has a lot of, socio-political issues, economic issues and whatnot. But it still has natural resources. And it's just positioned at probably at the most important geopolitical and geoeconomic choke point in the world, which is the Horn of Africa, the Bab el-Mandab on the Yemeni side. Yeah. If you look at Socotra, which is a Yemeni island, which is just off the coast, it's almost like an aircraft carrier in that very, very important maritime trade route in that corridor. And so whoever controls the Bab el-Mandab and the Horn of Africa controls most of the flow of hydrocarbons and trade going from Asia to Europe, from east to west and north to south. So hence why the British were there as well. I mean, it's an immensely important choke point. So instability in Yemen is not a local issue. I mean, it's a geopolitical, it's a global issue. And it's one that, insurance companies, banks, anybody who will involved in shipping, everyone who's trading is interested and should be interested in the stability of Yemen. So it's not just some backwater. And before we go and talk about UAE and Saudi, I think it is important to understand that globally Yemen is an absolutely important factor in global stability.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about what happened this past week, the bombing of this weapons shipment, the ultimatum, Saudi Arabia's ultimatum towards the UAE. And I know in our last program, you talked about the tensions that exist between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we saw that in real life over this past week. And of course, the UAE retreating from the south and its ally, the STC, in the south of Yemen. Explain just that to us. Like, why did Saudi Arabia feel it necessary to bring out in the open these tensions that really did exist, as you've described on previous programs for a number of years?
Well, we have to go back quite a lot in history if you want to do it justice. But, if we want to start in 2015, which is the so-called Saudi-led war in Yemen, where, the Saudis kind of bore the most of the burden of that war in 2015. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman at the time, just became crown prince. He was the defense minister. He wanted to make a name for himself in Saudi. His dad had just become king. And so he wanted to position himself as a doer, a maker. And he wanted to go into Yemen to say, okay, I give it a month. We're going to eradicate the Houthi militia that had taken Sana'a the year before, and the war will be over in 4 weeks' time. And we want the rest of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, to help us. And so the Emiratis came along. Obviously, the Emiratis are a very potent military force, and they did come along, and they were very successful on the ground. But as this war then started to become a quagmire, in many ways, Yemen is the Vietnam of the Saudis, if you will. I mean,
or the Afghanistan.
Or the Afghanistan, whatever kind of analogy you want to use here. Yeah. But it was clearly not. It was operationally, tactically, and strategically a disaster for the Saudis. The Houthis obviously not only have not been pushed out of Sana'a, but have probably consolidated more power than ever. Yemen now is more divided than it was before. But the Saudis very much relied on the Emiratis as a proxy on the ground to support that operation.
Yeah.
And what we see over time, this coalition of then 2015, 16, 17, we see a growing split or rift where the Saudis are stuck fighting this war against the Houthis in the northern part of Yemen, and the Emiratis, by building their own network of different militias on the ground in the south, embedding them in what is a fairly organic local narrative of southern secession and independence, using that narrative to embed their militias in that narrative, started to invest more bandwidth into actually consolidating power in the south rather than fighting the war against the Houthis. And so we're seeing the very first, very thin cracks in 2017 when the Southern Transitional Council is formed as an umbrella organization for all these different militias on behalf of the Emiratis. And then as we move forward, 2019, the Saudis are trying to really rescue the growing rift by creating this Riyadh agreement, where they wanted to reunite all the different factions in Yemen under an umbrella of an anti-Houthi coalition. Yes. But at that point already, the STC and all these different militias the Emiratis had been supporting were already off the leash, if you will. They were already out to consolidate their power. And so what we saw last week is the end of that very long process, where over time the STC became more and more a de facto state with political power, economic power, extreme diplomatic support, and financial support from the Emirates, and Saudi being left to kind of administer the rest. And so that has been brewing and simmering for years. And I think this strike on these two ships that arrived from the UAE to Mukalla, to the port in the south of, or southeast of Yemen, that is really a manifestation of these grievances the Saudis have had for quite a long time. And that was, they said, now enough is enough. You crossed the red line, and we're willing to use force to enforce these red lines.
And why now? Like, what led to the Saudis? Because until now, there have been these simmering tensions, but the Saudis haven't made such a bold move as they did in this past week. So what happened in this past week to lead to that type of...
Not really what happened the last week, what happened over the last month. Okay. So in early December, we see the STC, who already had consolidated, all the beautiful cherries and crown jewels of Yemen, controlled most of it in the south, had then moved, made a push into the Hadramaut and Mahra, which are the eastern provinces of Yemen, if you look on a map, and were trying to seize key choke points in these provinces, which the Saudis consider to be core spheres of influence for Saudi Arabia. And they pushed further and wider than the Saudis expected, and probably more than what the Emiratis intended them to push for. And that all happened and that's an important part in the wider discussion of the axis of secessionists, that sort of arc that we described last time, is to bear in mind that the Emiratis were doing this as the Saudis were using their convening power, their leverage in Washington to put pressure on the UAE with the Trump administration over Sudan. So, the Saudis very, very much antagonized what happened in Sudan with the RSF and the UAE support for it, put pressure on the UAE in Washington. And at the same time, the Emiratis are saying, okay, you're putting pressure on us in Sudan, we're going to put some pressure on you in the south of Yemen. So it has to be seen within that context. It's not out of, it wasn't a spontaneous sort of STC operation in southern Yemen. It has to be seen in that context. They want to deliberately put pressure on the Saudis And they succeeded in seizing a lot of territory and putting pressure on the Saudis. And the Saudis are quite slow to react. So it took them quite a while to say, okay, now we're putting pressure. And this is what happened last weekend.
I am so honored to be here today for the inauguration of Baitulmaal Mogadishu Hospital, a milestone for Baitulmaal to start a hospital which is badly needed.
People will find treatment, people will find a better life, people will be able to live more normally.
Here in Somalia, around 5,000 mothers and 25,000 newborns die every year. Almost all of these deaths are preventable. Baitulmaal Hospital, together with Al Jazeera University, are preventing those deaths.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
But when it comes then to the balance of power between Saudi Arabia and UAE, but the fact that UAE retreated so quickly, it was within the 24-hour deadline, does that indicate that the Saudis really have the upper hand here when it comes to just sheer strength and force?
No, because it's two entirely different models. Again, something we discussed last time, strategic culture, I think, is very important. The way that Saudi Arabia does foreign policy and security policy and the way the Emiratis do it are fundamentally different.
Right.
Fundamentally different in terms of the means and the ways they're using, but also fundamentally different in terms of the ends and the values they're pursuing. But what is key here is the networked approach the Emiratis are using, multi-layered, delegating through to surrogates and intermediaries. And the Saudis using state-on-state sort of relationships with partners, using the international organizations, the UN and whatnot. And so in terms of agility, the UAE are far more agile than the Saudis are. And if you look at Yemen, they have really a network of different actors they can work through. The STC is somewhat the political umbrella, but you go underneath that umbrella, then you have so many different brigades that have received training, equipment, and direction, and any form of material support from the Emiratis over the years. And the Saudis have tried to emulate that by having their own sort of proxy forces in Yemen, but none of them are as agile and resilient as the Emirati model. Plus, the Emiratis control the core choke points on the sea, right? So they can resupply quite quickly, while the Saudi forces are now somewhat cut off from the seaside and have to be resupplied by air over Houthi territory, which is very, very difficult. So in terms of supply chains, the Emiratis far more agile. The Emiratis also have supply chains through their ports on the other side of the Horn of Africa, right, in Somalia and in Eritrea and so on. So they can really, they're far more agile to position their forces as they see fit. Plus, the Saudis are risk averse. They tend to be much more patient, waiting, seeing what's going to happen. The Emiratis are far more transactional, far more risk prone, more assertive, more Machiavellian, as we discussed last time, and they seize an initiative as soon as it occurs. And the Saudis can't deal with that kind of tempo that the Emiratis put forward. And so it took the Saudis quite a long time to wake up to what happened last month, to then make reaching out to partners such as the Omanis, who hold a very key portfolio when it comes to Yemen, to discuss with other partners around the region of saying, okay, what is it that we can actually do here? And then they did react and they did respond, and quite harshly. But going back to your question about the Emiratis willing to withdraw, the Emiratis made an announcement in 2019 already that they were withdrawing from Yemen. So, and we know they haven't. Right. So this is now the second such announcement. We're saying we're withdrawing, but they're actually probably not. Plus, even if we're seeing some planes leaving, we're seeing some forces being moved out of Yemen. So it's all very much signaling to the world we're leaving it. But if you look at it, the network itself, STC being the umbrella, that network exists. It's on the ground. It's funded. It's well maintained, well directed. That's not something the Emiratis can or will abandon, because it's a network they control. And so in that respect, the Saudis, even if they're asking the Emiratis to leave, the Emirati footprint in Yemen will be maintained by the STC and the proxy forces.
And what does the UAE hope to achieve from the STC? Why? It seems like they want an independent state carved out of Yemen. Why does that benefit the Emiratis?
So it's about strategic autonomy and strategic depth. I mean, the UAE, as we discussed many times, is a country of 1 million people, right? A small state by all measure, microstate in many ways. So for it to have this sort of leverage across the region, having these tentacles out, they need to delegate. And so the axis of secessionists, as I call it, relies on these kind of carved out spheres of influence within broader states. Bit of divide and rule sort of, it's a neo-colonial approach to divide and rule, very similar to what the Brits used to do in colonial time. You basically create, you invest in an entity that has an issue with central government, you build them up strategically. Most of the time they already have a secessionist narrative and appeal. It's organic, you invest in an organic community. And then you kind of, in that sphere of influence, you kind of build up your sort of foothold. And the STC provides exactly that. And they're doing it at especially around Aden. Aden is the most important port in this part of the world. It's a deep sea port. Obviously, the Brits have been there since the early 19th century because it was so significant for the resupply of shipping towards India that they couldn't do without Aden. And the Brits stayed there until the 1960s. So for 150 years because it was so strategically significant. And the Emiratis want control over that choke point. They want control and access to the port and connect this port to the ports they're already controlling on the other side of the Bab al-Mandab in Somalia and Berbera, for example, in Somaliland, in Puntland. And they're also now obviously expanding their footprint and influence in Jubaland in the south of Somalia. So this is all part of that sort of picture. But also it's about resources. I mean, the areas of Hadramaut and Mahra that the STC was pushing towards were those where you have oil wealth. So having access to oil is part of making the STC a self-sustainable, economically self-sustainable sort of entity. And lastly, what the Emiratis want to do is they're using the STC as a bargaining chip because they they can elevate themselves as a regional broker, a regional powerhouse. They can say to the Russians, as they have, if you want to have control or influence in this part of the world, we can introduce you to our proxies, the STC. They've done it. Israel, same thing. And they have been using the STC have introduced the STC and proxies to the Israelis. And the Israelis have a vested interest in having access, not just in Yemen to fight the Houthis, but having access to the Bab al-Mandab and the Indian Ocean. So, it's really about maritime security. It's about trade, but it's also about intelligence. And there is another issue that is being sort of overlooked a lot is Socotra in itself. I mentioned that this island that is, if you look at the map, the island that's kind of wedged between Yemen to the north and Somalia to the west, it belongs to Yemen. It's supposed to be part of Yemen. The STC is claiming it. And the Emiratis have really built a foothold there for intelligence. And you would wonder why. So one, of course, it's like an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But more than that, all the undersea cables that go from Arabia and Western Asia into Africa run through Socotra. So they have an intelligence unit, a single intelligence unit that's embedded there. And there have been allegations raised by locals in Socotra that Israelis were seen there as well. So it would be very, very interesting for the Israelis to get access to these undersea cables. So all of that is more about geopolitics and geoeconomics than it is really about the Southern cause. The Southern cause is just sort of a legitimizing narrative that they're using. And I'd say in many ways the STC is a pawn that the Emiratis are using to further their own interests.
So let me ask about then Israel's objective here, because there is this close relationship, close tie between the Israelis and the UAE. And in our last conversation, you talked about that relationship is very transactional. And you pushed back maybe ever so slightly when I suggested that there is more of an ideological tie between the two. And, your argument was, that the UAE gets something from that relationship and the Israelis get something from it. Now, some analysts have described, so I want you to talk about that, but also some analysts have talked about how the Israelis see their future in that region to be a future where the states surrounding it are carved up into mini states, and that keeps its security and its power, rubric or its balance of power against the surrounding countries. Like, how much do you buy into that narrative that one of Israel's long-term objective is really to see these countries carved up into smaller statelets?
So going firstly, the ideological element.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not dyadic. It's not either ideological or transactional. I think it's a bit of both. There is a very strong transformational foundation of that relationship between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
It is about fighting Islam and political Islam.
Right.
And what they're, a lot of the argument we've seen, which is kind of, bizarre. The people who've been advocating for STC sort of independence. Some of them were, Tommy Robinson, who I don't think even knows where Yemen is. But are people who've been recently in the UAE or have been people who've been recently in Israel. So the Israeli Hasbara network is now pushing that narrative of saying if you need to support the STC because they're the only ones who are fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, right? I mean, this has come up. And Al-Islah is the sort of Ikhwani Muslim Brotherhood offshoot in Yemen, who is, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood, but is very much ideologically affiliated. And so the argument is, and that's, I think, where ideologically the two align, where the Israelis and the Emiratis are saying, we're fighting that war against Al-Islah. It's not really about the Houthis. And we can see that going back all the way back to 2017, where the Emiratis bring in mercenaries to fight in Yemen, some of them being Israeli companies or Israeli individuals who are fighting basically capture and kill sort of operations where they go out and they hunt Al-Islah operatives or Al-Islah politicians and kill them. Assassination, killing squads, basically. So there is a very deep sort of ideological alignment in that respect. And I think for the Emiratis, it was always more about political Islam in Yemen than it was about the Houthis per se. And towards your latter point about the regional order, very much so. I mean, Israel is interested to, in order to control this part of the world, in order to create, they have this bunker mentality where they kind of dig in and say, it's us against the rest of the region. We don't want to reach out to the rest of the region, but we need to manage the rest of the region. So instability around the rest of the region is in our interest. If we can't get a sort of Abraham Accords deal like we can with the Emiratis, then the rest are basically our enemies, and then we have an interest to weaken them domestically. And the Emiratis, so the Israelis are interested in breakaway regions, right? I mean, they've been doing it in Lebanon. They've been trying to do it in Syria now with the Druze, and they're trying to do it with Somaliland and Somalia, where recognizing Somaliland. And I wouldn't be surprised if the STC, obviously we know this relationship between the STC and the Israelis, it exists already. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis weren't the first to recognize South Yemen as an independent entity. And again, facilitated by the Emiratis. But the axis of resistance, what it really does, and it's something that really only dawned on me over the last couple of weeks, because I'm seeing the Israelis really getting drawn by these Emirati, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the Emirati influences are being drawn into the Hasbara networks. I mean, we've seen loads of these bizarre accounts, Emiratis, tweeting against the Muslim Brotherhood, against Hamas and pro-Israel. But what we're seeing is this axis of resistance is really trying to isolate all the other former powerhouses of the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also the other GCC countries.
You mean the axis of secessionists?
Yes, sorry. Did I say resistance? Yes. Yeah, sorry. Getting confused. But we can talk about this later, because both of them kind of overlap a little bit in Yemen.
They have very many similarities.
A lot of similarities. Yeah. And so you've got the axis of resistance by Iran, but you also have the order, which is a bit more Saudi GCC-led nowadays, with Egypt involved, Turkey involved. They all want to keep territorial integrity and territorial sovereignty. Yeah. And the odd ones out are the Emiratis and the Israelis, who don't want territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think the axis of secessionists, going from Libya, Haftar has a very strong relationship with the Israelis, to the RSF that has a relationship with the Israelis, to Somaliland, which has a relationship with the Israelis, to the STC that has a relationship with the Israelis. You see that the axis becomes a UAE Israel-centric order. And the Emiratis are quite happy with this, because that's something they can sell to the Trump administration and the Americans, of saying, look, we can give you an order that you like, which is anti-Muslim, fighting political Islam, and is sidelining all these other kind of countries like Saudi Arabia or the Qataris or Oman or Egypt or Turkey. And I think this is where the Saudis are also waking up to. They're saying, oh my God, this axis that is being built right now is one that isolates us. It undermines our leadership in the region. And a lot of the emotional response in Saudi Arabia on social media kind of reflects that. They're saying, we are the regional leader. Debatable of whether they're the most powerful player. I would say the Emiratis are more powerful. Really? But they have this sort of request or this demand of saying, we are the regional leader. can't really act upon it, and are being extremely frustrated by the chutzpah, using that kind of word, chutzpah by the Emiratis to actually completely ignore that and do their own thing at the expense of Saudi Arabia.
I mean, why do you think? Because on paper, the Saudis should obviously have the upper hand here. Why do you think the Saudis are? You describe the UAE as being far more agile, far stronger, probably because of its network. Far more strategic. Why is it that the Saudis are failing where the UAE is successful?
For all the things you just mentioned. So it's not about the size, right?
Yeah.
Size doesn't matter in a networked global order that we're operating in today. It's about connectivity and who you can mobilize on your behalf, whether it's in the information environment or armed non-state actors such as the STC and others.
Yeah.
But it's also the commodity traders, the financiers, the banks, the insurance companies, the other trading corporations, commodity traders that you can mobilize, that you can use to generate influence. That's what strategy is all about. It's about generating influence and power.
Yeah.
The Saudis haven't understood how to generate power. Yes, they have the biggest military in the region. They have immense wealth through also their public investment fund. But they're still very hierarchical in the way they operate. They're still
Down to MBS?
Not necessarily. I think MBS made the country far more agile than the previous leaders.
Right.
But Saudi Arabia today is hamstrung by quite a big bureaucracy. It's still quite hierarchical, bureaucratic. And for them to make a decision takes forever. In the UAE, it's I call them the Bani Fatima, right? Muhammad, Tahnun, and Mansour. The three of them make the strategic decisions between them, bringing in their own sort of minions, and then they delegate this out to whatever entity they want to operate with. So it's a very, very direct sort of chains of command, if you will. They can respond very quickly. They're very agile. And the Saudis, on the other hand, apart from the fact that they're risk averse, they don't have these sort of networks. And the networks that they have generated in Yemen, for example, aren't as agile. They aren't as multi-layered. And when they come under pressure, they don't have an alternative. The Emiratis could abandon one of their proxies if they wanted to in Hadramaut, for example, or the giant forces or these other sort of entities. They could afford losing one of them and still have the upper hand because it's a multi-layered network. And I think that's something that the Saudis and none of the other Gulf countries or other Arab countries have.
How would you describe the Trump administration's stance on what's happened in this past week? Because, historically we could find some form of strategy within the American foreign policy, grouping, but it just seems to me that the Trump administration isn't particularly engaged. Maybe I'm wrong, but particularly engaged with the details of the skirmishes and tensions that exist between its allies. Saudi Arabia and the UAE would be termed allies of the Americans. Like, how are the Americans treating what's happened in this past weekend and those ongoing tensions between these two powers?
Well, the Americans, again, they're very similar in many ways to the Emiratis these days. So you have a very small group of people making all the decisions on the very top, bypassing the bureaucracy of the State Department and Defense Department and so on, and also bypassing the experts, people who've been working on Yemen, for example, for decades, and making their own decisions based on very sort of almost on basis of ChatGPT kind of level of depth in terms of what needs to be happening. I think much of Yemen's policy came to the open on Signal with this Hackseth group chat where they basically discussed what they're going to do next in Yemen. And this is it shows what kind of administration this is. It means they are very agile. They might not, because they're extremely unpredictable because they act very swiftly. But they don't have a policy, they don't have a strategy, they don't have a vision for Yemen. And so the Yemen conflict really shows, obviously, the Americans relying heavily on the Omanis to speak to the Houthis and kind of bring this deal about, and the Omanis are delivering on behalf of the Americans. But after that, nothing. I mean, it's not like they're translating the ceasefire with the Houthis into a sustainable solution to the conflict, because the Houthis are still firing in Israel, they're still firing at the vessels. And the Americans have nothing in terms of an idea of what could come next. Same is true for Somalia and Somaliland. The Emiratis have been lobbying heavily the Trump administration to recognize Somaliland And so far, the Trump administration hasn't made up their mind. The narrative that the Israelis are selling is, look, Somaliland might, not only are they normalizing with us, but they're possibly taking over some Palestinians that you can then get and push out of Gaza, which might be appealing to the Trump administration. And beyond that, Somaliland is, again, strategically positioned. They're saying we're willing to host an American base. If you want to operate in this part of the world, we cannot make this happen for you. And the Emiratis are pushing that. And the same with the STC. They're pushing it, saying if you want basing in this part of the world, we can provide you with a sphere of influence where you can do the basing. I just don't think the Americans are interested in basing anymore in this part of the world. They already delegated loads of that counterterrorism, these counterterrorism operations to local proxies, which are the Emiratis in many ways. So yeah, I don't think there is much of a policy or a strategy when it comes to this part of the world in Washington.
So can I ask you about the national security strategy, which came out, of course, a couple of weeks back? And I don't know, it didn't seem like it was much of a strategy beyond, it was very short and it, some of it was contradictory and didn't tie together. But the conversation or the narrative within that strategy about the GCC, about the Muslim world, was almost the Muslim world now has settled, and we've made peace supposedly between Gaza and Israel, and now it's really a case of just maintaining that, and our focus is now really on the East and on China and other places. I mean, beyond what we see in that document, maybe just echoing what you said there, does that imply that the Americans have really given up on the Middle East in an active way?
Look, for the most part, if you live in this part of the world, you're Arab or you're Muslim, you would welcome the MAGA's approach to this part of the world, for the most part, right? If you juxtapose this with the neocons on the other side,
which is an active,
being proactive and imposing a particular vision onto a world which is so different to the American vision, I would choose MAGA every day, right? I think there's a lot more alignment nowadays if you're from the region with MAGA than there is with the neocons. And first and foremost, the neocons are the ones who are still pushing us. We need to unequivocally stand with Israel, whatever Israel does, whatever genocide Israel is involved in, we stand with Israel. That's not MAGA. MAGA says this is not in our interest. And the interest-only approach says America is not withdrawing from this part of the world, but we're delegating. We're happy to work to lead from behind, letting local partners bear the burden of conflict, whether it's the Gulf GCC countries or the Egyptians or anyone else, but also saying we want them bear the burden and we don't want more conflict because we don't want to get dragged in. Israel is the odd one out here because they keep on dragging the Americans back in. And so I think this national security strategy is a reflection of that vision, of that MAGA vision for this region, where we're saying, we have interest in this part of the world, but we want to collaborate. It's about interdependence rather than, sort of transactional. There's a transactional element, obviously, to create that interdependence. But it's not like, America doesn't have a problem with the Muslim world. And I think that's kind of part of the message. It's also the MAGA message is we don't have a problem with the Islamic world. 9/11 is a long time ago. We made a lot of mistakes, and now we need to re-engage. And pragmatically, a lot of pragmatism here of saying, wherever the growth is coming from, wherever the money is coming from, and I do agree that for the most part, the Americans look at the Gulf as an ATM, but it's still, they're very much, Trump and his family and the organization, I think, are very much interested in working pragmatically with this part of the world, which is a lot better than the alternative view that we get from the neocons, which says basically Arabs are second class, whether they have money or not, and should always be second class to Israel in this part of the world, even if it doesn't serve American interests. And the neocons are extremely ideological, right? They're mostly born and carried on by these fundamentalist Christians. MAGA is not ideological in that respect.
Right. But then MAGA is, when they view the Muslim world, they see it as this ATM, but also they see the Muslim world from a sort of stability lens, and the autocrats and the dictators are the ones responsible for that security. And so in that sense, there is an alignment with the neocons that ordinary people and their aspirations are not going to be met by this administration. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's a fair characterization, I'd say. But it's all. I think that's true for every branch of American foreign policy. They, if you're not a democracy and they only value their own liberal Western democracy as legitimate democracy, then you might as well work with the autocrats and the authoritarians, and they don't really make a difference there.
Yeah, let's talk about Abu Dhabi's grand strategy
Yes.
here, because we have discussed this now on a couple of occasions, but I'm fascinated, and I know our viewers in the comment section are fascinated by, just the statecraft of the UAE. Even if we deplore it, we hate it, and we know what they've done in Sudan is unacceptable from any humanitarian standard. But they have created this network of mercenaries, of businessmen, of propagandists, of logisticians who operate at arm's length. They're not directly connected, at least there's a plausible deniability there. But they achieve the strategic interests of the Emirates. What is the grand strategy there? What is the UAE really trying to do here beyond the immediate, the immediate ends in, say, Yemen or Somalia or wherever it may be?
So the UAE want to, or Abu Dhabi. I think we have to be very careful here because there are differences between these 7 Emirates, right? It's Abu Dhabi. It's an Abu Dhabi strategy.
Right.
It's Abu Dhabi strategic culture. It's the strategic thinking of the Al Nahyan and Mohammed bin Zayed in particular that really lead that very innovative approach to statecraft in many ways. Yeah. And its overall is creating Abu Dhabi or establishing Abu Dhabi as a hub in a hub and spoke system that is regional. As the hub and the go-between for every sort of transaction that takes place, right? They look at the region, at the region of flows rather than a region of states, flows of, of commodities, of capital, of people, of ideas. And if you're the hub in these flows and every flow flows through you, or maybe Dubai, you have influence, right? And you use that to generate influence. That's what I call network-centric statecraft. It's very similar to how the British Empire built its empire. It started off through interdependence, right? It was trade on trade. It only became very coercive and exploitative in the latter part. But initially, it was a small island state like Britain on the periphery of the world with 4 million people. With the Indians, when the way they described the Brits when they arrived, they described people with bad teeth and terrible hygiene, and they looked at them as inferior beings, and they didn't take them seriously at all. But within 100 years, they kind of crippled the richest country in the world, India at the time, and made it their own and subverted it through these sort of networks that they've built. And obviously, it took a lot of intermediaries to make this happen. It wasn't just a handful of Brits who were able to do this. It required a lot of collaborators on the ground in India. But it was the divide and rule that kind of allowed them to happen, to do it. And I think a lot of the thinking in Abu Dhabi now is how can we as a small state, looking at England as a small state in the year 1600 when the East India Company was founded, just around the corner from here, how can we emulate this and build a similar empire that is built around, built on networks? And obviously the UAE, more than England even, or less than England, don't have the capacity to maintain these networks and these interrelationships. So they needed to delegate. And one thing they have that Britain didn't have is this immense endowment financially where they can just pay people to do it. And so that's why they had this hyper development. It's not just development, hyper development in the last couple of decades to become that hub in the region. So it's about strategic autonomy. It's about strategic depth. It's about relevance in the world and elevating yourself from a small state to a middle power and the broker that can connect the Russians, the Americans, the Israelis, the Chinese to this part of the world. And in many ways, they've achieved this. If you want to do any business in this part of the world, it's very difficult for you to avoid, dialing 00971, which is their kind of country code. You got to go through the Emirates one way or the other. If you want to solve any of the conflicts, they're already a stakeholder there. And that's what they were trying to achieve, of being indispensable. And in many ways, they are indispensable. But that's why their vision is now clashing with the Saudis, who also wanted to be indispensable in this part of the world. They wanted to be the broker. They want to be the leader.
Yeah. There are some commentators who argue that Mohammed bin Salman has come of age in a way. He's moved beyond that initial display of bravado where the Lebanese prime minister was hauled up in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, and the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And some argue that this past week has shown that maturity in the way that he exercises power. I mean, we've seen the ending of the siege on Qatar in 21. We saw the opening up of ties with Iran in 23. I think the Saudis initially actually opposed any US bombing of Tehran, at least publicly opposed it, right? I think they've plastered over the disastrous war in Yemen by using the Omanis to broker an easy but a peace deal with the Houthis. From your perspective, because your previous answer seemed to display that the Saudis haven't quite moved beyond those initial phases. Do you feel that the Saudis have matured and there is and maybe this past week shows a departure from that old sort of MBS, slightly, very erratic form of foreign policy making?
So I think we're in the third phase now. So the initial phase, 2015, very erratic. He's still almost teenage boy who loves video games. And, a lot of the stories about, Saudi had a lot of problems at the time. There were different ways, I think, of how to, shake the tree and make sure that those corrupt networks were kind of in the kingdom were broken. Yeah. He chose a very radical way of, remember going to the Ritz-Carlton, hanging people by the ceiling and, all the kind of stuff that happened there, coercing people, making people disappear. Yeah. Very erratic. They had the war in Yemen without a clear strategy, just saying we're going to bomb the Houthis out of Yemen, out of Sana'a, and we'll win this. Very erratic, didn't. And also same, the rhetoric towards Iran, very escalatory, all the way until 2019. I do think the second phase that kind of happened, the Jamal Khashoggi incident is probably the single most important turning point in MBS's reign. Because first of all, a lot of these erratic people around him were dismissed. He brought in bureaucrats and technocrats who were there because of meritocratic sort of, based on meritocracy, basically. People who could get the deal done, but also people who knew how to maintain relationships with the rest of the world that MBS first had to learn. And also knowing that, this was a massive mistake that he supervised, right? So he, very much implicated in that. And so the second phase is Saudis saying, okay, we need to be more pragmatic. We have to be more patient. We have to, also focus inward because development is everything. And if we want development internally, we need stability in the region. We can't escalate further. We need stability. And so he's mended ties since 2018, 2019 with the Biden administration and with the Europeans, attracting people, attracting some FDI to come into Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And so that's the second phase. Now, the question is, and this was sitting and waiting, right? You mentioned Qatar, very pragmatic, very deep ties now, but also reaching out to the Iranians, saying the only way we can deal with Iran is through diplomacy and engagement, not through military means. And now this, even with the managing the relationship with the Emirates for a long time was through diplomacy and engagement, trying to invite MBZ over last year to speak to him directly over Yemen and, to know he was, it didn't really change anything. But now using military force on a tanker, or on a vessel that brought in armored vehicles, wasn't really, it's not striking the Emiratis directly, but indirectly. Is using military force. That was, I'm not saying it's uncalled for, but it was a shock to the system in the Emirates. They didn't expect that because that guy who was always about patience, sit and wait, now suddenly is using force and saying, maybe I'm coming of age. And so we might see a new phase of MBS because MBS, the sitting and waiting strategy of not having a clear assertive strategy is not working for Saudi Arabia because they're being outmaneuvered by the Emiratis. They're being outmaneuvered in Sudan. They're being outmaneuvered in Somalia. They're being outmaneuvered in Yemen. And you could make the argument they're being outmaneuvered in Gaza as well, because here the Emiratis are leading because they have that special relationship with the Israelis. And it was the Emiratis who were putting a lot of pressure on Saudi, saying you need to normalize, join the Abraham Accords, and the Saudis saying no, we don't want this. We don't want this at any cost, and we want to lead this in our own way. So I think we might see a new MBS coming of age who is more assertive, still more calculated than he was in 2015. I hope so, because what is required to contain the Emiratis is a Saudi that is able to act more assertively when necessary.
And a new realignment in the region between Saudi Arabia and potentially Qatar and Turkey and Egypt.
I think that's an important one. So as I said, if the axis of secessionist is one that is trying to isolate Saudi, Egypt, Turkey, which it effectively is doing. I mean, you ask any Egyptian, they're being on the opposite end of any of these Axis powers, whether it's the LNA in Libya or the RSF in Sudan, Ethiopia. The Egyptians really feel the squeeze, but At the same time, they're a beggar state, still requiring quite a lot of money from the Emirates. But what you're effectively seeing is a new world, a new regional order through this axis, which is Israel Emirati-led, everyone else being isolated. So I think the Venn diagram between Saudi and Turkish interest and Saudi and Egyptian interest has just increased quite significantly over the last couple of months. And I think the Emiratis are underestimating how that could potentially isolate them even further. And they might take the hit and say, we don't need them anymore because we got Trump, we got the Israelis, we don't need the rest. But it's a very awkward position to be in, considering that the Emirates are surrounded by countries that are not aligned with the Emirates and disagree with the Emirates on pretty much all foreign policy issues.
Now, Andreas, you know that many of our viewers really want there to be some form of alignment within the Muslim world where Muslim countries tend to, at the moment, they tend to work against one another, against their interests of the people, instead of working with one another and building these economic and cultural and political ties that very much is required for the Muslim world to move forward. How close are we to that idea of Muslim unity that's eluded the Muslim world probably for the last century?
Well, yes. I mean, we're further away from that than ever. I mean, there are two levels. On the state-to-state level, we see major wedges between royal families in different states. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily that important. I think it's more the people-to-people relationship is more important. Yeah. And I do think that the one issue that has brought Muslims together, Arabs together, the region together on the people-to-people level is the issue of Palestine and Gaza. Yeah. And that is maintained. I think people have woken up. And it's the same mobilization that also feeds into advocacy for for Sudan and for or against the atrocities being committed by the RSF. Yeah. So there is a feeling of empathy across the Muslim world, which I think people are waking up to. But on the state-to-state regime level, the regime obviously doesn't want this to spill over into any political power, because it's a sort of dynamic nobody can control. Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't exist just in the Gulf. It exists across the Muslim world. I think that is very powerful. But if it's not being translated into politics, and it can't, because most of these countries, there's no outlet for democratic will onto governance or on statecraft, then it might be meaningless. But I also think moving forward, I think as the divide is widening between what people want and what the regimes want, what the states want, that is an unhealthy relationship. It's out of balance. And eventually we'll have to come back to some sort of balance. And we might see that at the moment in Iran, where a lot of that mobilization is happening, where there's such a gap between the people and the regime. If you don't manage that relationship, it will come and haunt you. And the Emiratis think in particular, hence why they're so scared about the mosque, why they're so scared about mobilization, why they're scared about the people, is because they can't control this dynamic. And they think they can subvert public discourse to make sure that this will not arrive on their shores. But Palestine has arrived on their shore as well. And I think Emiratis, even if they don't speak out publicly, those who are not on the payroll of the government, see the atrocities being committed, must disagree with what the government is doing, particularly those in the Northern Emirates. And if you speak to Khalijis, you speak to people from the Gulf who come through London, who've been here over Christmas or New Year's, from all different backgrounds, they speak to one another, right? They sit there, have coffee, you've got an Emirati, you've got a Saudi, you've got a Qatari, you've got a Omani, whatever, a Kuwaiti, sitting around the table, discuss these issues. And I'm sometimes part of these conversations. You realize that the Emiratis are the odd one out in all of this. And so even the Emiratis are citizens don't want to talk. I mean, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance there where they're just like, okay, well, I don't want to discuss my government's policy. Yeah. But they witness how others discuss what they're doing. And so eventually I think there has to come a point of reckoning, even in Abu Dhabi, where they're saying maybe we need to readjust our foreign and security policy.
Let me ask you about, you talked about Somaliland, and Israel recognized Somaliland as an independent country, the first country to do so. Somaliland, of course, has de facto been independent or semi-independent from mainland Somalia for many decades. What was the role of the UAE in this announcement?
So Somalia is strategically very important. Somalia as a country in the Horn of Africa, obviously, it is the Horn of Africa if you look at it geographically. So the Turks, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Emiratis, all have an interest in making sure Somalia is somewhat aligned with their policy. You don't want to have influence there. Somalia is a federal country, so it has federal states that have quite a lot of autonomy. If you look at Puntland and Somaliland in particular, quite a lot of autonomy. Historically speaking as well, I mean, Somaliland has been its own country, so there's a very strong organic claim to say we need to succeed from Mogadishu. We're an independent country. The Emiratis have arrived really, I mean, they've always, not always, but they had already in the early 2000s, they had relationships with Somalia for agriculture, very similar to Sudan. But it was really 2011, 12, when it was DP World, Dubai Port World, as a company wanting to set up a foothold in Somalia. And they were reaching out to these breakaway regions, particularly Somaliland, see if there is a way for them to get access to ports in Somalia. And it was a commercial relationship, nothing problematic. Mogadishu allowed it to happen. And so for the decade that followed, the Emiratis are doubling down on infrastructure projects and then allowing, infrastructure projects connecting ports to airports, connecting them to railway, connecting them to land routes, and connecting them into the inland of Africa. Particularly Eritrea and Ethiopia, where the Emiratis also have quite a lot of leverage. And so that kind of maritime or logistics project, this, I don't know, part of financial statecraft, if you will, or logistics statecraft, this is where Somaliland played such an important role. On top of that, the Emiratis then reach out to political elites, lure them into, doing business in the UAE, reaching out to the defense and security sector domestically, training missions, equipping them, and thereby allowing this entity, which is already an autonomous region in Somalia, to actually no longer requiring the federal government, not requiring Mogadishu for any support, because they're almost self-sufficient now because of that relationship that they have with the United Arab Emirates. So Somalia has, very similar to the STC or the RSF and the LNA, Somaliland is also part of that axis because the Emiratis have layers upon layers upon layers of investments there across the spectrum from economics to security sector to politics, where if you wanted to do anything in Somaliland, it wouldn't happen without the approval of Abu Dhabi. So this recognition of Israel, of Somaliland, wouldn't have happened without the Emiratis advocating for it. And we have on the record here in the UK and also in the United States, lobbying firms on behalf of Somaliland have gone around advocating for why Somaliland should be an independent country. And a lot of that PR, or all of it, was paid for through the UAE or were companies who were based in the UAE. So that's not coincidental. And so for Israel now to take that first step is also not coincidental. That was only possible because the Emiratis allowed it to happen. All the votes in the Arab League, for example, that obviously push back against this because it undermines this this sacrosanct value of territorial integrity. All of these condemnations of that move were not supported by the Emiratis. They didn't vote together with other Arab countries. So it's very clear that the Emiratis really wanted this to happen, and it's very easy for them to let it happen and say, oh, it's the Israelis did the first step, so maybe we can take the second step, or maybe someone else in our axis can take the second step. Maybe Morocco will take the second step. So there is a lot of movement, and the Emiratis have been lobbying, also using their diplomatic clout, to advocate for Somaliland recognition. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Great. And one last question for you. I mean, lots of our viewers would be students of politics and international relations, and I know that's your field. And often students of undergraduates will be studying, realism as a school of thinking. I mean, it just seems to me that, UAE should be central stage in any conversation about realism today. I mean, it is the most Machiavellian state. The way you describe the way in which it functions and its statecraft. I mean, this is realism 101. I mean, is that a fair...
I definitely something that I use the UAE and Abu Dhabi a lot in my courses and my teaching as an example for pure realism, the most purest form, not neorealism or anything, the most Machiavellian sort of 16th century or 15th century sort of view of interest-based foreign and security policy. Yeah. And it is really all about maslaha. It's all about interest. It's not about values for the UAE. Yeah. And in some respects, people admire that because they're saying that, okay, there's a country that really cares for its own people. Yeah. And they don't, and it's very interesting in the way that the UAE, or that Abu Dhabi in particular, has become so obsessed with interest that they're even willing to throw their own countrymen and their own family under the bus. I mean, there's a long history in Abu Dhabi of fratricide, of cousins killing cousins, brothers killing brothers, more so than in other royal families in the region.
Yeah.
And that shows that they when they think it is in the interest of the regime or in the interest of the country, they're willing to, do whatever is necessary. And that kind of persistence and focus doesn't exist in any of the other Gulf countries. And they have the means to do it. And it goes back to the point about strategic culture I made last time. There's a very Bedouin approach of, we're pursuing our interests no matter what. And, the collective, which is Abu Dhabi, it says, the collective interest is the interest of the Al Nahyan.
Yeah.
That interest has to be pursued at any cost against any sort of enemy. And it also shows that the Emiratis don't have any permanent enemies or friends. It's very clear. I think the Saudis have woken up to this now. The Emirates only has interests, and that's what they're pursuing. And it's something that I do think will come and bite them eventually, because after all, they are part of that region. They're part of that local fabric. They can't ignore the rest around them. And if you do everything through coercive and compulsive means, and never find a ground of consensus, it will come and backfire. There will be a counter reaction. If you're coercive, there will be coercion coming right back at you. And I think the chicken will come back to roost eventually.
I've just received some news from a friend of mine who knows I'm speaking to you today. I'll read it out. Yemen's Saudi-backed government launched an operation to take back military positions from the UAE-backed southern separatists on Friday today, and said it had reclaimed one of the largest military camps in Hadramaut province. Any comment on that?
No, so this morning we've seen quite a lot of movement on the ground where, the Saudis have for the most part relied on air power to project force and influence in Yemen. But they've now backed also their ground forces in Hadramaut to take more initiative, and having the air cover, they can make rapid advancements. The question is it sustainable or not? And this is my big question mark in all of this is the Saudi forces on the ground have not shown that they're resilient enough to maintain gains on the ground. And for the STC itself, Hadramaut in Mahra is a bonus. It's not something they necessarily need per se. And for them to withdraw from this wouldn't be a defeat at all, because, at the core, they're very consolidated. And Hadramaut and Mahra alone are not going to save the PLC, which is the Saudi-backed or UN-backed government in Yemen. So more needs to happen. We need to have some sort of dialogue in Yemen for this to actually be resolved.
Dr. Andreas Krieg, it's really been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.